Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we're going to be continuing with our series of shirim on the healing waters of Rabbeinu Ha'arizal. And once we've made our way through the introductions of where the Arizal was coming from and what we want to try and glean from the Ari as symbolized in the life process of the Ari, which again is starting off in Yerushalayim, descending down into the banks of the Nile River in Mitzrayim, and ascending afterwards into that hidden light of Sfas, of Marav Tuvcha Sher Safanta L'Rayecha, we are now going to begin, Be'ezras Hashem, to enter into the sugyos of the Arizal. And what we're going to do is we're going to take one sugya at a time in the order that we can assume that they took place on the temporal framework of things taking place one stage after the other. In fact, we have to reorient temporality completely in order to understand the words of the Arizal, but for our purposes, which is ultimately to follow the light of the Ari into the Torah of Rabbeinu Habal Shem Tov, as well as Rabbi Nachman ben Fega, which sees the Eitz Chaim Kadisha as a Sefer Musar, which means that we have to be able to apply the teachings of Kabbalah to our lives in a way that they're going to have a real transformative effect. So we're going to look at each and every sugya, and we're going to try and glean a little bit of insight into the day-to-day vicissitudes of life, and to try and elevate ourselves ever so slightly into the space of His Karvus to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to taste from the Or Kitov. Now, once the Arizal begins to speak, we enter into this first sugya, which becomes perhaps the most famous sugya of them all, the one that people want to focus on most, the one that people want to interpret most, which is the secret and the sugya of Tzimtzum, the secret of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's process in creating the world. Now, the secret of Tzimtzum, the concept of Tzimtzum, is already a language that is found in Chazal. It's found with regards to Tzamsim Shchinaso bin Badei Ha'aron, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu reduced or minimized the presence of himself, the Shechina HaKadosha, in between the space of the Badei Ha'aron. So already we see in the utilization of Chazal the notion of Tzimtzum as a condensation of sorts, a gathering in and a collecting of all dispersed energy into one particular singular point of intensity, which becomes the dwelling place. So we have this language of Tzimtzum in Chazal itself. And then interestingly enough, the time that Tzimtzum comes up most in terms of the lumdus that Chazal want us to understand is the sugya in Erchin about Efshar L'Tzamsem or Efshar L'Tzamsem. Efshar L'Tzamsem or Efshar L'Tzamsem, Tzimtzum in the language of Chazal, in that sugya, is the question of precision, is the question of the capacity or the incapacity to grab hold of the immediate point in which something is taking place. The question ultimately of Tzimtzum Kipshuto or Eno Kipshuto is whether two things can actually take place simultaneously without one being before or after the other. This question of whether Tzimtzum is possible or not looks at the possibility of two things happening simultaneously, two heads of an animal coming out of the mother animal at the same point, and the question becoming which one is going to have the quality or the status of being the Bechor, if in accordance with the naked eye, both happen simultaneously. The question of Tzimtzum, whether it's possible or not, means that we cannot come to terms with which one came first, in spite of the fact that there might be a precedent before or after one coming before the other. Nevertheless, the human mind is incapable of grabbing hold of that precise singular point. Means that a person is incapable of reducing their vision to the most significant and central point in the entire sugya to try and understand it. Efshar L'Tzamsem means that a person does have the tools, does have the capacity of determining the precise moment, that light of precision. So the notion of Tzimtzum in general is a question of the emergence of precision, the moments of minimization for the sake of absolute precise knowledge of something. There's also precedent within the earlier Mekubalim, certainly in the Ramak, certainly in the Mekubalim that preceded the Ramak, of the nature of Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is not a novelty of the Arizal. The way that we're going to understand Tzimtzum, or the placement of Tzimtzum, of contraction or concealment at the crux of the system, might be a chiddush of the Arizal, as we're going to see, which may be why it had to be uncovered specifically on the banks of the Nile River, mamish the place of Tzimtzum. But nevertheless, there is precedent up to Tyrus Moshe Rabbeinu of the concept of Tzimtzum. We're not going to be translating the language of Tzimtzum yet because it goes by many translations: concealment, contraction, hiding, removal, etc., etc. And we're going to come to see that all of the definitions and all of the terms and conditions that we could potentially even apply to the sugya are always ultimately going to fail, not because we're not smart enough to grasp it, but because the very nature of the sugya of Tzimtzum evades any possibility of definition, so to speak. The impossibility of defining that which we need to define is in fact the symptom of the Tzimtzum itself. But for our purposes, we're going to be looking at the question of Tzimtzum as it emerges in the writings of the Arizal. Now, when we look at the first instantiation of Tzimtzum as it's described by the Ari in Eitz Chaim Kadisha, meaning to say in the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital, what we come in contact with in Eitz Chaim Kadisha and Heichal Aleph is the fact that prior to the creation of the world, prior to the emergence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's desire to create the world, there was an infinite saturation of the infinite light of the Rabbanu Shlalem. The Rabbanu Shlalem's light, the Rabbanu Shlalem's presence, so to speak, saturated all possible space. And in order for there to be the emergence of a space that was devoid of godliness, so that creation and creatures can begin to take shape, there needed to be a certain minimization, diminution, removal, concealment, hiding, exiting of that infinite light of the Rabbanu Shlalem, so that something other than the Rabbanu Shlalem can take place. When infinitude is present, finite is not possible. When the unlimited is present, limitation becomes an abject stira, a paradox or a contradiction to the ever-present nature of the Rabbanu Shlalem. So what we're setting up is a binary opposition. When the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is present, then anything else that is not the Rabbanu Shlalem is an impossibility. Now, before we go into the mechanics of Tzimtzum, here it's important to kind of frame a little bit about the conversation of why is HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing this? The Tam Habriya. What is the purpose behind HaKadosh Baruch Hu's desire to create the world, which becomes the very engine that drives the purpose of Tzimtzum? Tzimtzum is an instrument. Tzimtzum is the way, Kavyachol, through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world. But we know that any activity is preceded by a desire or a ratzon that is rooted in higher levels of experience that motivate that activity. And just as we experience that in our own lives, that there are motivating factors that give birth to a choice that we make, so too we can extrapolate from our limited human consciousness and look upwards towards the way that the Rabbanu Shlalem Kavyachol creates the world and assume that there was some element of reasoning that led up to the desire to create the world, as we're going to see. And this is really where the question of Tam Habriya comes in. What was the purpose for the creation of the world? Now, ultimately speaking, what the Balatanya points out, and what all of the tzaddikim point out, is that Ein Tam L'Ratzon. In the end of the day, when we speak about the reasons that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done something, it is not because this is the absolute reality of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to do. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have to do anything, never had to do anything, and never has to do anything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Shalom B'chol Minei Ashleimus. There's no chisaron, there's no deficiency without HaKadosh Baruch Hu expressing himself, without HaKadosh Baruch Hu being metzamtzim himself. So there is no actual need, so to speak. Even Avodah L'Tzarach Gavoa, even the notion that HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs Klal Yisrael Kavyachol. Klal Yisrael is the highest point in the entire conversation, but even there we're aware of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs absolutely nothing. The concept of need itself is directly opposite to the concept of the infinite. So when we speak about the reasons, we're always speaking about a secondary level of understanding. We're talking about once we are fully aware that there is only unfathomability, that in the end of the day, we have no absolute grasp of anything, especially the mechanics of why HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose to create the world, and that in truth, the only simple reason is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to create the world. Kacha, that's it. Just like when you ask a young child, about why they're in a mood, a mature individual is going to give all sorts of explanations, all sorts of rationalizations and intellectual reasonings. But a child, when they're in the mood, they're going to say just cause. And ultimately, that's going to be the deepest theory of emotion that the human mind and all of its complications is incapable of grasping. Ultimately, things are just because they are. HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to create the world. Kad salik b're'usa l'mirvei alma, when it arose within the infinite will of the Rabbanu Shlalem Kavyachol. Again, we're already talking about limited levels. If we're speaking, we're talking about limited levels, and Mamela, we're not talking about God himself, which protects us from any of the heretical issues that arise with trying to discuss limit or unlimited when it comes to the Rabbanu Shalom. The highest level of what we discuss in Kabbalah, as the Arizal makes abundantly clear, is Or Ein Sof. Or Ein Sof is not Ein Sof. The light of the infinite is not identifiable with the infinite itself. The infinite is undefinable. The infinite is the Etzem, it's the Atzmus Baruch, which remains perpetually removed from our capacity to grasp it linguistically or intellectually or even emotionally, in spite of the fact that it's ever present. Like we've stressed so often, the question and the interdiction against our ability to talk about the essence of the Rabbanu Shalom is not because it's not presence. All that's presence is the essence of the Rabbanu Shalom. The question here is in terms of hasaga. What do we have the capacity of grasping through our intellectual processes, our emotional processes, and our verbal utilization of language to give shape to ideas that are makifim and not panimim? And once we come to the very clear definition that we are never, ever, 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 ever talking about the Rabbanu Shalom b'chvayda uva atzmo. The mechuyev hametzias, all we have to accept and all we can possibly accept is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the mechuyev hametzias. It's a necessary existence once HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to create the world, and it's the only true necessary existence. Nothing else is necessary. Everything else is contingent, and all we can do is affirm by way of negation what we don't grasp about the Rabbanu Shalom to come to a place of knowing that we can never know anything whatsoever. Once we've come to that first stop, then we can begin the conversation about Or Ein Sof, why Hashem revealed himself, why Hashem didn't reveal himself, so that we're never getting caught up in the mistake that we're talking about Atzmus Yisbarach. This is the Klal Gadol, that once we realize we're never talking about God himself, itself Kavyachol, because that's an impossibility, then all language that we have is still within the safe framework of the elasticity of Emunah, where I realize that at the end of the day, I'm not claiming any absolutes. All I'm claiming is giving shape to my Emunah. So once we realize that we don't have any possible recourse towards understanding why HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvaydo yiv'atzmo kaviyachol decided to be mitzamtzim himself and create the world, then we begin to question and have the ability to extrapolate reasons, potential reasons for the creation of the world. Now, Chazal have a number of reasons, but let's first and foremost look at the Arizal. The Arizal, after the Rishonim and after the, so to speak, philosophers of Yiddishkeit, the Arizal came along and really finally took the question of God's absence seriously enough to try and come up with a theoretical model that would allow us to come to terms with the balancing paradox that we live in, which is the ultimate presence of God's infinitude at every moment, and also at the same moment, the presence of limitation and levels and mechanisms of connection and disconnection, et cetera, and how both operate in unison. So we'll start with the Arizal. The Arizal gives two reasons for the creation of the world, something that we've spoken about extensively in the past. In Shar HaKlalim, which Rav Chaim Vital says already in the Hakdama, not to necessarily learn if you want to learn in the process of how to learn Eitz Chaim, because it seems to be an externalized chapter that doesn't necessarily bear an impact on the mahalach of the 50 sha'arim of the Eitz Chaim, ad kedei kach that it's not nechshav as one of the 50 sha'arim. Nevertheless, what we have over there is that the Arizal gives a reason for the creation of the world, and the desire that motivates HaKadosh Baruch Hu's creation of the world, meaning to say what drives the Tzimtzum, what drives HaKadosh Baruch Hu's concealment or restriction or hiding of himself or removal of himself, Kavyachol. It's the desire of Chayk HaToiv Lehetiv, that the goodness, the ultimate good, the capital G good, which is the essential goodness of the Rabbanu Shalom, the Chesed Amar Yivra, the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a Kael of Chesed, is a God of Chesed, and that it's an Olam Chesed Yibara, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to build a world of Chesed. So the ultimate motivating factor behind the creation of the world is that the ultimate good, capital G good, in its essence wants to be so, its lowercase g goodness upon some sort of receiving, upon some sort of vessel. Memela, in order for the ultimate capital G good to reveal the lowercase g goodness that is inherent to its goodness, there needs to be something that is susceptible to receiving that goodness and appreciating that goodness and finding that goodness. And in order to necessitate that, there needs to be a playing field where the good can be received volitionally. And the Choyka Toiv Lehetiv implies that the entire purpose of the creation of the world is for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bestow goodness upon us, that Hashem wants to do good. Baruch Sha'amar V'haya Olam. The motivating factor behind the world is that it is good, everything is good, and things are going to continue to be good. This is the Nekuda that the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, took and placed at the crux of his system. As we saw in the Lashon of the Kamarna also, this is the ultimate truth of what Kabbalah is coming to teach us, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to bestow good upon us. But this entire concept for the Ramchal becomes the reason for Bechira, because all of the concealment in the world is there to ensure that there's an even level playing field where there's equal parts concealment and revelation, so that I am not compelled by absolute force to engage in goodness, but rather I get to choose it out of the instability of my own volitional gestures, which makes the goodness far more powerful to me. Because as Ramchal tells us, that we don't want to eat from Nehemah de Kisufa, we don't want to eat from bread of shame, we don't want to eat from something that we haven't earned, because one who eats from what they have not earned is incapable of gazing in the face of the giver. And the purpose of Bechira, the purpose of concealment, is to enable our sense of earning that goodness. That's what the Arizal says in Shar Klalim, that the purpose of the creation of the world is Kichoy Katoiv Lehetiv. Elsewhere, what the Arizal writes in Shar Aleph, as we're going to see when he speaks about the Tzimtzum, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu contains, so to speak, all manners of expression. The infinite contains the capacity of expressing itself by limitation as well. The infinite contains the capacity of expressing itself by way of finitude as well. The problem is that all of these potential expressions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's koach, all of the potencies of godliness, so to speak, that can be expressed to human beings so that God, Kavyachol, can be understood and grasped for the greatness that he actually is, all of that is seemingly impossible without an area that is capable of receiving and recognizing those expressions of potentiality, because potential without actualization is devoid of actual actualization. So in order for potential to begin to actualize itself, and for the infinitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to fully unfold properly, for all of those kochos and those names and those kinuyim and those nicknames that we apply to godliness, in order for those things to emerge and become reasonably utilizable by human beings, there needs to be a tzimtzum. So the second reason that the Arizal gives, or the first reason, depending on how you're counting the chapters, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal his shleimus, and the only way to reveal his shleimus is to create a chisaron, is to create a deficiency where there appears to be an absence of godliness. And specifically in that place, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to reveal himself, whereby we can receive and accept and appreciate and understand all of the kochos of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So those are the two reasons that the Arizal gives, Choy Katoiv Lehetiv and Begin the Yishtamudin, that we should come to know him. What Chazal speak about when it comes to the purpose of the creation of the world, and what the Alter Rebbe speaks about in Parak Lamed Vav, is the fact that Ratzah Kadosh Baruch Hu lios ladir b'tachtainim. All of those elements are true. Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to be still good. Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal his fullness from the state of potential into actualization. But ultimately, the tachlis is for that actualization to take place in the lowest place imaginable, in the place of a hastara shebetoich hastara, a concealment that is doubled over itself, a place of chashach hakafel and mechupel, a doubled over darkness that even when you dig through the first layer of darkness, you come to find another layer of darkness. It's specifically there in the nether regions that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal himself. And as the Rebbe Rashab writes in the Hakdama, not the Hakdama, the beginning of Hemshech Tafresh Samach Vav, that when we say dira, it's a dira mamish. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to be megalech chvoidu va'atzmusa kavyachol lamata me'asarat tfachim, in the lowest place imaginable. And therefore, what will necessitate the capacity of being in a place that appears to be devoid of godliness, devoid of rectification, devoid of possibility, devoid of justice, devoid of righteousness, is going to be the halal, is going to be the place of this worldliness. And it's specifically there that we're going to be able to reveal the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's another reason given for the creation of the world. Ultimately, there has been a big machlokas made by certain meforshim in our generation and in previous generations between these stiros in the Arizal. We find these two reasons for creation. On the one hand, it's that Choy Katoiv Lehetiv, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to bestow goodness upon the creatures. And on the other hand, we have this concept that the Rebbeinu Shalom wants to express his wholeness and his fullness and his achdus to human beings. And there's been a machlokas built out of this. Zok the Leshem Shabbat Chaloma, and it's a davar pashut because it's svara pshuta, but it's only pashut because the Leshem Chaloma pointed it out to us, is that in truth there's not a machlokas here. There's no machlokas, because in truth, what is the ultimate goodness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to bestow onto human beings? The ultimate goodness is the human being coming to understand the yichud and the achdus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and ultimately coming to realize that I myself, in my own individualism, in my own particularization, in the separation upon separation upon separation upon separation that gives birth to my own sense of independency as a separate creature apart from the infinite flow of all things, that process is all there so that I can then come to realize the achdus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Coming to terms with recognizing Ein Od Milvado, coming to terms with recognizing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is found everywhere, is ultimately the greatest good that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can bestow. And that goodness comes about when HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself. So when we look at the Arizal, who says that there's two reasons, one is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to bestow goodness, the other is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal his achdus in all of its fullness, is really two parts of the same exact coin, because the ultimate goodness that the human being can ever come to experience in this world is grasping the achdus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Memela, the two central reasons for the creation of the world, which are goodness and the expression of unity, are going to be seen as part and parcel of the same reason, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal the greatest goodness in the world. And what is that greatest goodness in the world? It's the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unity within the places of disparity. And then we could even include the Shita of Chazal, of Dir B'Tachtonim, that where is this goodness going to finally be revealed? Where is the biggest chiddush of understanding light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu going to be, of his achdus? It's specifically in what we feel is pirud. As Mamela, what we have is the three reasons for the creation of the world align very nicely. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal his goodness. What is the goodness? The goodness is coming to terms with the awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unity in the places that we did not perceive that unity. And there's no greater place, no farther or more distant place than HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unity than this world. Mamela, this world is the opportunity to reveal God in the place where it appears to be most separate, which is ultimately the greatest pleasure in the world, the greatest goodness in the world, which is the motivating factor behind why Hashem created the world, so that we can experience the goodness of coming to terms of recognizing that we are part and parcel of the process of the Rabbanu Shalom in this world, Be'ezras Hashem. So those are the Ta'amei Habriya. But ultimately, those questions lead up to the process in which Bria takes place, which we're going to see is going to be identified as the Tzimtzum. The language of the Arizal in Shar Aleph is as follows. The Ari writes as follows: Da, a person has to know, Ki terem shena etzlo hana etzalim v'nivru hana evarim, that before the world of Atzilus formed, before the world of Atzilus unfolded, and before the world of creation, the world of separation were created, Haya or Elyon Pashut Malakol Matzias, there was an ascendant, simple light that saturated and filled all of existence, all of potential existence. V'lo Haya Shum Makom Panui Bebechinas Avir Rekani V'Chalal, and there was absolutely no empty space in the aspect of empty air or a void whatsoever. Ela Hakol Haya Memula Meor Ein Sof HaPashut Hahu, but rather all of that vacant potential space was saturated and filled with that simple light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unity. V'lo haya lo b'chinas rosh, v'lo b'chinas sof, ella hakol haya or echad pashut shav b'hashva achas. There was no up, there was no down, there was no sides, something we're going to discuss when we discuss the Kav, but rather everything was a singular, simplified unity that operated in a state of equality and equanimity, in a singular equality and equanimity. Hashva achas, v'hu hanikra or ein sof. And the thing that was saturating all space, that made the up and the down, the right and the left, the empty and the full, equal in the eyes of the Rabbanu Shalom, was the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinite light. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided within his simple will to create the worlds and to allow the world of Atzilus to unfold in order to lahoitzi or hashlemus pu'uloisav v'shemoisav kinuyav, in order to allow his fullness and all of the full potential of his potentials and capacities to express themselves in their fullness, as we understand that this is the purpose of the creation of the world. Or Ein Sof, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzamsem himself from his infinitude, b'nekuda ha'emsa'is, in the innermost point, asher boi be'emsa, that existed in the center, oire mamish, in the center of his life. in the center of his light. V'tzamtzim ha'or hahu, and that light was reduced, contracted, concealed, hidden. That light was mitzumsam v'nisrachik el tzadei svivos hanakuda ha'imsais, and the light was pushed away from that innermost point, which is now left empty, and it extends back to the periphery. It extends to the sides of that centermost point. V'az ish nishar makom panui v'avir v'chalal reikani minikuda ha'imsais mamish kazeh. And what was left in the wake of this removal at that innermost point was a place that was panui, it was vacant, the avir, the halal, it was simply air, and it was a void, rekani, it was empty in that center innermost point. V'hine hatzimtzum hazeh haya b'hashva achas b'svivos hanekuda ha'imsais harikanis. And this tzimtzum was equidistant on each level, leaving that empty dot in the middle, ba'oifen shemakom hachalal, to the degree that that place of the void, haya igul mikol svivosav b'hashva gemura, was like a circle that was equal by every side of it. V'lo haya b'tmunas meruba bal zivos nivtzeves lefi shagam ein sof samsim smog b'bechinas igul b'hashva achas. And there were no edges, there were no shapes, there was no square, there was no triangle. All there was the equidistant space of the circle itself. So what we have over here is that we first and foremost come in contact with the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed his light. HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed something. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was seemingly mitzamsem, something that was previously present, and in its wake is left an empty, voided space. An empty, voided space. So here, in this Shita of the Arizal, we really come into contact with the entire theoretical machlokas between the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon, which is really a machlokas between the Shomer Amunim Akadmoin and the Mishnas Chasidim in terms to how to understand this process of Tzimtzum. What is this process of Tzimtzum? What does it mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed himself? What needs to be taken as a first postulate is that there is no emptiness in the entirety of existence. There is no possibility that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is actually removing himself. Ein oid milvado ksiv. Like we said before, the entire process that the Arizal is coming to teach us is how the infinite and the finite can interact in unison, and how the finite is not a contradiction to the infinite, but rather the finite is the chosen vehicle through which the infinite will be capable of revealing its true essence, which is the secret of revealing how down here is also infinite, thereby revealing the great capacity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be present both in presence as well as absence. As Mamela, we have to first and foremost understand that Tzimtzum eino kipshuto, that Tzimtzum is not an actual thing, meaning to say that Hashem does not actually remove himself and create a space in this world that is devoid of godliness. Kuli alma lo pligi, nobody disagrees. There is no possibility of conceiving of anything in reality, person, place, thing, where in its essence, in its core, is not completely saturated and subsumed by the infinite light of the Rabbeinu Shalom. The question again is one of hasaga. What is the grasp that a human being is capable of grasping? So when we read in the Arizal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mitzamtzim himself, so it seems, if we're going to take the Arizal literally, as we should, as the Leshem Shabbat V'Chaloma tells us, that's the only thing we can do. So then when we look at the writings of the Arizal, it seems that there was an actual vacancy that took place, right? The Lashon of the Arizal was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzamtzim himself. And where did that tzimtzum take place? Where did that tzimtzum take place? Hine az tzamtzem es atzmoi ein soif b'nekuda ha'emsayis asher boi be'emsa. He concealed himself in that innermost point, in the middle, be'oirei mamish, in his light. Amar Meir, but Rav Meir Paparish adds, who was the editor of the writings of the Arizal, be'archenu amar haravzeh, that this is simply in accordance with our own relative understanding. Meaning to say that the first postulate that needs to be grasped before entering into the sugya of Tzimtzum is to understand that all of this is simply relative to our own conception of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, but we're never actually talking about the actual presence or absence of godliness. Both terms are saturated and subsumed within the unlimited presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world. And the Meforshim point out that this Tzimtzum took place meaning to say, the Arizal says that the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was removed, and it's specifically the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu which was removed, and not the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because like we said, we're only talking about his light. So even if we wanted to say that the light itself was actually removed, that the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is removed, that's never coming to claim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu removes himself in some fantastical way that would be very difficult to even conceive of what it might actually mean to claim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually removed himself, and all of the difficult theoretical issues that we would run into, and the ungraspable paradoxes at the heart of it. It's an impossibility to conceive of anything as actually being absent. So when we are having a conversation about whether Tzimtzum is real or not real, literal or not literal, we have to understand what is at stake. And what is at stake is never whether or not HaKadosh Baruch Hu is present. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always present. Ein oid milvado. That is the aleph beis, that is the shin and the tuf, that is the beginning, the middle, and the end. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always present. Memela, once we have that postulate in our mind very clearly, then we can begin the process of understanding what does it mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed his light? Did he actually remove his light? Was it a light of concealment? Was that light concealed? And that's where we enter in to the seemingly historical machlokes in terms of how to understand Tzimtzum, whether it be by way of literality or whether it be by way of figurative. The literal school that was championed by the Mishnah's Hasidim, Rav Emanuel Chayreki, and theoretically, historically followed by the Vilna Gaon in one way or another, even though the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon, both the Leshem, the Nefesh HaChaim, Rav Menachem Mendeleev Shklov, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Chaver, Kuli Alma Lo Pligi, that the Gra was never speaking in the Lashonos that are attributed to him. Nevertheless, the Lubavitcher Rebbe Schlusi Hagan Aleinu in his Igeres, which discusses the distinctions between Tzimtzum and the Shita of the Gra and the Baal Shem Tov, the Lubavitcher Rebbe does uphold a distinction of 5 various, very delicate levels, which is enough of a reason for us to hold on to the fact that, yes, there was a disagreement in terms of how to understand the nature of Tzimtzum, but that doesn't mean that there was an actual fundamental machlokes as to what Tzimtzum was. It's a question of applicability rather than the question of essence. And Mamela, the derech of the Mishnah's Chasidim, the Yosher Levav, was to say Tzimtzum was a literal event. In order for us to begin to allow ourselves to talk about limitation in a healthy and realistic way, we have to assume that HaKadosh Baruch Hu removed his light entirely from this space, and therefore there's going to be the room for individual kind of apparently separate elements to come into shape. Not, God forbid, that there is actually emptiness, but rather that we have to take the emptiness seriously. And following that, the Mishnah's Chasidim and the Lesha makes this clear. The Vilna Gaon in his base medrash, in whatever framework that means, that's for another time and another shir of what the Gra Shita and Tzimtzum is, but they claim that the Tzimtzum was kipshuto. The Tzimtzum was an actual event, which meant that there was an actual departure of godly light from that space, which leaves us in a functional space of reality that, for all intents and purposes, is halachically devoid of the annihilating light of the infinite. Following the Mishnah's Chasidim, following Rav Emanuel Chayreki, was Rav Yosef Igras. Rav Yosef Igras, the Baal Shomer Amunah Makadmon, who in our generation, through the great, amazing work of Rav Avri Noam Frankel, we have a full translation of this, one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental, Sefer of Kabbalah, written in the previous years. The Shomer Amunim Akadmoin, the Shomer Amunim says and goes through all of the various reasons why it is heretical and difficult to ever lay claim to the fact that Tzimtzum was some actual event that took place or there was an actual removal, etc., but rather it was figurative. It was a concealment as opposed to a withdrawal. There's no absence, there's only hiddenness. And this Shita of the Shomer Amunim Akadmon was certainly followed by the Baal Shem Tov, as codified in particular in the Beis Medrash of Chasidus Chabad, by the Balatanya, by the Mittler Rebbe, and in particular by the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Rashab, and the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. So we have these two opinions of what the nature of Tzimtzum is. The Shita of the Mishnah's Chasidim, who seems to have been an inspiration to what the Welt historically has come to understand as the Shita Sagra, is that there is a literal removal of the light in this place, and the activity in which human life and experience is going to take shape is going to be in a world that is theoretically, halachically devoid of the annihilating light of the infinite, so to speak, and our job is going to be to serve Hashem from that space. Masha'in Kain, the Shitos of the Shomer Amunah Makadmon, which seems to be what gives birth to the Mahalach of Taras HaChasidus, is that no, there is no removal of the light. The light itself is all saturating. The Rabbanu Shlomo's presence is found above, below, inner, middle. Yes, there are interdictions against engaging with that light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in certain places. Yes, it is is forbidden to utilize this idea to the wrong way, but one must keep in mind that the light of the infinite is perpetually present, and any apparent absence is simply a concealment rather than a removal. So ultimately, we can look at these two shitos of understanding Tzimtzum as expressed in the Eitz Chaim Kadisha, of this emptying of that innermost point. The Mahalach of the Vilna Gaon and his base medrash, theoretically, historically speaking, as rooted in the Mishnah's Hasidim, would identify the act of Tzimtzum as an actual act of withdrawal, which somehow removes the infinite light of godliness, thereby ensuring that the modes of connection between the infinite and the finite are going to be by way of governance and hanhaga, etc., versus the Shita, the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, following the Shomer Emunah Makadmon, which is that no, there's no actual removal, there's no removal, all there is a concealment. The distinction in between these two concepts cannot be overstated. When I look at this world and I encounter a world where HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence is not immediately available to me, which Kuli Amalo Pligi agree is the reality of being in this world as a human being, where Hashem does not appear absent at first glance, does not appear present at first glance. So in accordance with how we understand Tzimtzum, there's going to be a very different application of what Avodas Hashem looks like. In the base medrash and the Shita that says there was an actual removal of the infinite light of godliness, in spite of the fact that God's essence is everywhere, nevertheless, in terms of our graspability, there is a removal of that infinite light. So then all of my Avodas Hashem is a process of drawing back down and allowing something that was not present to become present, allowing something that was not here to now reveal itself as being here. So there is an or in sof kavyachol, there is a light of godliness that is distant from me in this moment, and I have to climb and climb and climb and go there and then draw it back down into that place that I'm in. That's going to be what comes about if we look at Tzimtzum as an actual withdrawal, as an absence that now needs presence. Something is empty and now it needs to be filled. But if we look at Tzimtzum from the other perspective of Tzimtzum Eno Kipshuto, and that the Or Ein Sof never actually removed itself. Kuli Amalo Pligi Atzmusis Barach is always present, but we're talking about the Or here in the Shita that says that Tzimtzum is Eno Kipshuto. So now what we're dealing with, rather than a withdrawal, which necessitates a drawing back in, we're dealing with a concealment, which does not necessitate a drawing back in, it simply necessitates a revelation, because the difference between withdrawal and concealment is that withdrawal says what was once here is no longer here and now it's gone and it has to be brought back. Concealment, on the other hand, is operating within the framework where nothing is absent, everything is ever present, it's just concealed. And Mamela, there's no need to draw something back in because everything is already always present. So what do we need to do in terms of grappling with the Tzimtzum? It's now a question of refining the concealment to the point that we come to a recognition of revelation. When I talk about drawing something back down which once left, so there's a temporal framework to that. It was once here, then it was gone, and now I draw it back again. Masha'en Kain, when I'm talking about concealment, everything was always ever present. There's no before, middle, or after. It's just a question of conscious awareness of it. And the revelation within the concealment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has always been there is a megala milsala mafreya, not that I was able to draw something back down that was once absent, but that I'm coming to understand that everything was always already here. And in terms of how I grapple with what it means to be a human being in any given situation, which is the tachlis of it all, this is going to have a profound impact on how we look at scenarios. If I find myself in a place of difficulty and concealment, am I going to look at the tzimtzum in my life now as an actual withdrawal, which means that the light of the infinite is not present to me right now, and I have to go through A, B, or C in order to reveal it, and if I'm capable of A, B, or C, then good. If I'm not, then no. Versus the recognition that no, the light of the Rabbanu Shalom is here no matter what. It's always here. It's perpetually present. And the elements in my life and in my mind that are preventing me from coming to terms with that, of believing in it, of living with that, are the concealments of the mind. And those concealments, rather than needing to be filled up again because they've never been empty, simply need to be undone in order to come to see the emes la'amisa, which is einon levado kepshuto mamish. It reorients us towards how we deal and how we're mismoideid with the encounters of prevention and concealment in our life. One will tell me I have to run away from this difficult situation because I need to learn how to draw back down the positive situation, which is not present here. And that creates a sense of diffusion and difficulty and separation. Masha'en Kain, the real perspective of Tzimtzum Eina Kepshuto, is the recognition that no, I don't have to draw anything back down. Everything that I need is always already right here in front of me. And it's a question of zichuch. It's a question of refining. This mahalach is also championed not only by the Baal Shem Tov, but also by the Rashash, and the Torah Chacham, as the Rebbe points out, because that entire basis of the Rosh Hashanah and the Torah Chacham is ultimately built upon the notion that everything is always present. It simply has to be understood, grasped on the relative grasp of reasoning to reveal its presence. But nothing is ever absence. It's just a question of what level of presence am I actually tapping into. Now, that is with regards to the first Shita of the Arizal when it comes to Tzimtzum, that Hashem removed himself in order to create a space. Now, this notion of Hashem emptying himself in order to create space is not the only way that we can look at Tzimtzum. We've spoken also about the fact that the Arizal had another Talmud. It wasn't only Rav Chaim Vital who was the Talmud of the Arizal, but rather there was Mahari Saruk. There was the Kabbalah of Rav Yisrael Saruk, who spoke of Tzimtzum in a very different way and in different mechanics, which are going to help us come to a place where all of the shitos of Tzimtzum are going to be meschaber biachad, and the Tzimtzum itself is going to be niskala, to be the deepest revelation of the Rebbeinu Shalom. In the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, like we said, those are the olamos above and beyond the Ak and the Abiyah, the Adam Kadmon, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzira, and Asiya of Rav Chaim Vital. Here in the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, what we're talking about are the olamos that are above it, from descending order up to the highest level. We're talking about Adam Kadmon Stima'a, which precedes the Tzimtzum of Rav Chaim Vital. Then we're talking about the Avir Kadmon, which is the place of the Tihiru Ilah, and then we're talking about the Olam HaMalbush. These are the worlds that existed within, so to speak, the infinite light of godliness. Because like we said, the infinite light of godliness is not the essence of godliness, but it's already a revelation of godliness. And Mamela, if it's already a revelation of godliness, that means it was preceded by a certain element of Tzimtzum, because as the Vilna Gaon points out in his beer on Safed Tzniusa, every aspect of revelation by necessity is preceded by a tzimtzum. The Arizal is talking about one expression of tzimtzum, but the tzimtzumim rabim are found at every single level of existence. Anytime there is a revelation, anytime that there is anything graspable, it means by definition that there was a condensation, a concealment, a removal of some ungraspable thing before it. So what was the tzimtzum prior to the tzimtzum of Rav Chaim Vital that we can grasp from the world of Mahari Saruk, from the world of the Kabbalah of Rav Yisrael Saruk? And here Tzimtzum goes in an entirely different direction, which is really coming to fulfill and make whole the image of Tzimtzum as we understand it in the writings of Rav Chaim Vital. In Mahari Saruk, we are never talking about absence. We are only talking about a reinstantiation of presence. The question is, how does Hashem reveal himself? What is the motivation? Where is the friction coming from that allows this autogenetic process where HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself, Kaviyachol, from within himself? And the secret of this process of revelation, that Tzimtzum is the capacity of Hashem revealing himself. Yes, it might be a removal or a condensation of sorts, or a condensing of sorts, but that's only so that there can be a further expression of something. And in Mahari Saruk, this motivation, this movement, the sha'ashuim that begin to take shape within the self-same unity of the Rebbeinu Shalom is the Hisur, the Hisurus of Gevura, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has this Gevura, has this precision that he wants to reveal, has this capacity of manifesting, so to speak, in the singular dot of the Os Yud, in that tiny infinitesimal point of significance that is so tiny that it doesn't actually have a Hisrachvus or Hisarchus to it. It doesn't have a width or a depth. It simply is. It's the Nukud of Etzem. How does this emerge? How does the writing process take place? How does that Nukudas Dio, that drop of ink, which is the same Osios as Yud, how does that begin to take shape on the page? And here in the Kabbalah of Mahari Saruk, rather than seeing the dynamics of removal, we begin to see the dynamics of expression. And the expression takes place by way of motivation, and the motivation takes place by way of friction, and the friction takes place by way of separation, and the separation takes place by way of intensification, and the intensification takes place by the way of a deep desire to reveal itself. Because in the Kabbalah of Mahari Saruk, we're dealing with self-same unity. There is no separation. Memela, there is no possibility of relationship. All relationship is the process of two things coming together to reveal something more. But if everything is the self-same and all there is plain unity, then there's no possibility of relationship in order to reveal something more. So in order to reveal more, there is a necessity of a splitting between a self-same unity to reveal two edges of that unity. And in the space between those two edges, there can now be a place for the desire of reconnection, the sha'ashuim, to merge once again, to reveal reveal again and again, more and more and more. So there's a separation which allows for a friction and an intensification and a multiplication of individual parts. When something is split, that means that there's two now. So now we have an act of splitting and the space between, which now allows the desire for those two elements to reconnect themselves to reveal another expression of unity. This happens over and over and over on a subatomic quantum level, ad kedei kach, that eventually the speed and the friction in which all of these removals and connections, folding and unfolding, the sha'ashuim, this inner movement of minei ubei, that inner pleasure that takes place from the desire to move outwards, but to be held back and retreat at the face of the self-limitation, and then to push forward and surge again, and only in order to retreat back and forth until something is niskala. That is the process of the tzimtzum of Maharisarg. It's a process of self-expression. It's a process of emergence. It's a process of a concealment, yes, that emerges, but the concealment emerges not from outside of the thing that is being concealed, but it emerges as a strength of the thing being concealed itself, meaning to say that the tzimtzum is like the shell of something that is covering the very thing it's coming to hide. This is the language that Maharisaruk uses based on Chazal, and Rabbi Nachman uses it, and the Leshem uses it at length, that the secret of the Tzimtzum is kahadein kamsa de levushim minei, that the secret of Tzimtzum is like the locust whose exoskeleton emerges outside of itself. When we look at the exoskeleton of a locust in the language of Chazal, what we see is that the sheath, the protective layer, is emergent from within the very body of the locust itself, which means to say that the thing that is coming to hide the body of the locust is in fact part and parcel of the body of the locust itself, so that what we might see as a concealing agent or a tzimtzum is not something separate and apart from that which is being revealed or being concealed, but rather it is a further instantiation of the revelation of the Ribbono Shel Olam. That the capacity for the Ribbono Shel Olam to conceal himself is simply a further expression of the Ribbono Shel Olam himself. Kahadein kamsa de levushim minei ubei. And Mamela, when I come in contact with that sheath, when I come in contact with that concealment, instead of saying this concealment is something separate and apart from the infinite that is hidden underneath it, we come to understand that the tzimtzum itself is just another way of HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealing himself. That when I come in contact with the skeleton of the locust, it's not something separate. It is the locust itself. That the movement and the extension outwards of the infinite, which by definition negates all possibility of movement outwards because movement demands separation, all of the processes and the sha'ashuim and the movement and the splintering and the splitting and the friction and the fractioning and the fractalization of it all is simply there to reveal a hitherto unrevealed koyach of Ribbono Shel Olam, which is the koyach of tzimtzum, which is the ability to be master himself. This gains a hint, right? Like we said already, that in the Kabbalah of Maharisaruk, we see expressions that are not found in the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital. But as we know from the Rebbe and the new Svarim coming out, and from the Leshem Shel V'Chaloma, everything that Maharisaruk was talking about is also hinted to in the writings of Rav Chaim Vital. And we see this in Mavos Sha'arim, and it's brought down in a Hagga'a in Eitz Chaim Kadisha, that be'emes, the Tzimtzum is something else. The Tzimtzum doesn't only mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was concealing himself in order to reveal a certain amount of light, but on a deeper level, which hints towards the Kabbalah of Maharisaruk, the Arizal and Tzimtzum is something as follows. Let me just find the place. In Mahadura Basra, the Arizal writes as follows: Inyan had Tzimtzum. What is Tzimtzum? Hu legalois sheresh hadinim. The entire tachlis of Tzimtzum was in order to reveal the potential and the roots of constriction and concealment. Kedei latet midas hadin, in order so that concealment and the expression of din could unfold. Achar kach in oilamos, and this koyach, this strength, is referred to as the butzina de kardenusa, as the black flame, kamoichite de kardenusa, something soft and hard at the very same moment, which is the impossible paradox of HaKadosh Baruch Hu concealing himself by way of revelation and revealing himself by way of concealment. In the world of Maharisaruk, Tzimtzum is no longer really a question of hiding, of concealment, and it's a question of how do things emerge. It's an emergence property. It's the question of how things begin to unfold. With these two positions in hand, we can begin to really understand what Tzimtzum means. Because as the Balatanya brings down that he heard in Mezhebush, he heard in Mezrich from his Rebbe the Maggid, who heard it from his Rebbe in Mezhebush, who heard it from the Baal Shem Tov, that the Pasuk says, Lo yisachalel b'shem kodshi, do not come and desecrate my name. What does it mean, don't desecrate my name? Lo ta'aseh halal b'shem kodshi, do not come and claim that there is an actual void. Do not come and claim that there is actual emptiness, God forbid. There is no emptiness whatsoever. Nothing nothing is void. That's a chilul Hashem, as the Nefesh Chaim describes. The greatest chilul Hashem is the notion that there is actually a halal, that there is actual empty space. Now that we've come to understand that the tzimtzum can take place in two ways, one is a way of removal or concealment, and one is a way of expression, we can come to understand how be'emes all of the different opinions are speaking towards the same nekuda. And this is revealed to us by none other than the Leshem Shabai Va'achaloima, who was utilizing expressions of Rabbeinu Azriel. But the Leshem is surprising because everybody comes to this agreement that no, the Arizal Tzimtzum, it's lav kepshuto. Tzimtzum is not real. Hashem is revealed everywhere, and it's simply a matter of concealment. Comes along the Leshem Shabai Va'achaloma and says, no, you know what? I feel that Tzimtzum is kepshuto, just like everything else is kepshuto in the writings of the Arizal. Tzimtzum is kepshuto. I agree, like the Mishnah's Chasidim that everyone got mad at, that the Balatanya takes issue with in Shar Yichud Ve'emuna, where he says that there are individuals who have a ta'us chamura. Sadok says on this level of the Mishnah's Chasidim's hasaga of Tzimtzum, it's a nebuch. It's a fact that even if a person has all of the proper devotions and intellectual properties, nevertheless they may come and make a mistake. Now, obviously, we're talking about a tzaddik yesod olam, Rav Emmanuel Chayreki, the Mishnah's Chasidim. It doesn't mean kepshuta that he made a mistake, God forbid. It simply means that it's not necessarily the proper way that we're going to understand Tzimtzum. But comes along the Leshem and says, no, I agree like the Yosher Levav, I agree like the Mishnah's Chasidim that Tzimtzum is kepshuto. How? Because just like everything else in the Arizal is kapshuto and we don't fully understand what it means, so too we can say Tzimtzum is kapshuto because we don't understand what it means. Because who says that Tzimtzum has to be an act of removal? Who says that Tzimtzum has to be an act of concealment? Tzimtzum is a further revelation of a strength of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which enables him to conceal himself in order for there to be the theoretical space where human beings can engage. This is not an emptiness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is not a diminution of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's strength and a removal of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, but rather this is a furthering, a redoubling, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is magala, a koyach hamastir, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals a radical power of concealment that allows this Welt and all of experience to appear to be the concealment of godliness, when in truth, our job is to dive deep down into the concealment of godliness through this koyach tzimtzum to come to understand the deepest secret of all, which is that tzimtzum is magala, the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. This comes directly from Rabbeinu Azriel, which we started off with, which is the ultimate crux of what the Arizal is coming to do, which is how does the infinite express itself in finitude without negating the finite nor the infinite? And the secret answer is that in order for something to be truly infinite, it has to have kaviyachol, the capacity of expressing itself in finitude, and that finite capacity of expression is not a reduction of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinite power, but a furthering of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinite power, because now not only is HaKadosh Baruch Hu found in the infinite, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu is found in the finite as well. Not only is the light found in the light, but it's found in the darkness as well. This giloy of a koyach hester, this giloy of makom, hine makom iti, is what the Leshem sees as the tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is real because it's the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu disclosing himself by means of concealment. That now, achen ata kel mistater, Hashem, you will reveal yourself by way of concealment, and my job is to find you within the concealment to come to understand that it's simply kahadein kamsa de levushim minei, that the tzimtzum is like the exoskeleton of a locust, which is emergent from within itself. This is really what Rabbi Nachman says as well in Torah Samach Daled, where he's discussing the paradox of the Tzimtzum. Rabbi Nachman doesn't say Tzimtzum is not real, Tzimtzum is real. Rabbi Nachman says Tzimtzum is not real and it's real at once. On the one hand, it's impossible that the infinite light of godliness is present in this moment, because if the infinite light of godliness is present in this moment, then this moment doesn't exist. There's no distinction, there's no space, there's no shape, there's no individuality. But on the other hand, we can't claim that the infinite light of God is not present. Elamah, so we're stuck in an in-between paradox. And Dr. Rabbi Nachman, this paradox is not meant to be undone, but rather the Tzimtzum is the paradox itself. The Tzimtzum is the secret that it's yes and no at once. It's empty and whole at once. It's concealed and revealed at once. Because this is the secret, Rabbi Nachman says, of the arba, of the locust. The locust is the gematria of Yitzchak, 208. What is an arba? What is the locust? The locust is the hagadein kamsa de levushim minei ubei. It's the secret of the exoskeleton of the locust, which emerges out of itself. That is the secret of Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is, yes, Hashem is hiding himself, but he's hiding himself by way of revealing himself. And the hiddenness is now just a furthering of that revelation, which means that every encounter that I have with concealment is simply another opportunity to uncover a furthered connection with the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is the Rebbe Shlita. Rav Yitzchak Meyer Morgenstern says mefurash that the tachlis is not to be mevatel the tzimtzum, not to say that tzimtzum doesn't exist, but rather to be mevatel the tzimtzum with the tzimtzum itself, to utilize tzimtzum, to utilize the reality of concealment, but to be aware that that concealment is the very truth that we'll come to understand, that will truly prove to us that there is no concealment, because we'll come to find that the concealment itself is a revelation of the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is the secret of the tzimtzum. The secret of the tzimtzum is that it's both at once, that it's concealment and revelation operating at once. It's the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants there to be a playing field, wants there to be a space wherein we feel that we have the volitional free will, which is absolutely real in that limited conception of our awareness and existence from the perspective of Das Tachton. In our perception, this is not fake, it's not a mistake, it's a real mistake, it's a real fake thing. It's a sheker amiti, it's a lie. Yes, the tzimtzum is a lie, but it's not a lie in the fact that it's kulo false. It's a lie that's true. It's Hashem decided to reveal himself by way of Tzimtzum. This is the biggest chiddush of it all. This is the joke of the Arizal. The big joke of the Arizal is the secret of Tzimtzum. It's the chakika. It's the engraving. It's an erasing that takes place by the very act of writing itself. Chakak is the gematria of Yitzchak. It's the shurish of the gevuros. It's the ability to engrave an engraving, which appears to be a deficiency or an empty space, when in reality, that very empty space is being engraved by the very thing that is engraving itself. And that the Rebbeinu Shalom is present in our lives at every moment, specifically when we come to terms for that moment to realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't reveal himself in this moment. Now, this secret of Tzimtzum, we're not going to get into it today. We're going to save for another shiur. The next shiur, we're going to talk about the halal that takes place afterwards, as well as the kav. But in terms of the practicality, Tzimtzum, this sugi of Tzimtzum reorients everything that we can think about ourselves when it comes to being a human being in this world. Concealment no longer means the absence of presence, which leads to all sorts of symptoms of distance, of loss, of negativity, of struggle, of pain, of difficulty, of things that are opposite to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and we begin to see Tzimtzum through the realm of a presence of absence. Everything is a furthering of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's revelation. As Mamela, any level of difficulty that I find myself in, which is a symptom of the Tzimtzum, can be understood to be a further expression of the Rebbeinu Shalom, which means that I can find Hashem here. Not only can I find Hashem here, but the tachlis is to find the Rebbeinu Shalom here, specifically within the Tzimtzum, specifically as the Ramchal points out, that Tzimtzum be'atbash is Yud-Ke Yud-Ke. It's the secret of revealing the highest light of the Rebbeinu Shalom, because it's specifically here in this concealment, in this exoskeleton, in this arbe, in this locus that I encounter in my life, which seems to be hidden, which in truth is going to be the very site where I come to uncover the furthering possibility of the Rebbeinu Shalom, which is that Hashem reveals himself through concealment. That is the chiddush of the Arizal, that the laughter comes about when we realize that those things which appear to be a deviation away from presence are in truth a furthering of presence, and that the choshech, the butzina, the kardenusa, the emptiness, all of these different things are not the opposite of light, but they're the re-intensification of light, which is now being revealed in a doubled way, in a newfound way, so that every ounce of tzimtzum becomes an opportunity for me to grab hold of emunah, to be ma'amin that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is here right now with me in the concealment itself. Rabbi Nachman says in the most powerful way imaginable, arbe, the secret of the locust, of haden kamsa de levushim inayubei, this emergent concealment that is part and parcel of the revelation of the thing that is seemingly coming to reveal itself, as the halacha dictates that I can't cover my head and make a bracha with my own hand because I cannot be a kisoy to myself. Something cannot cover its own self. So too the Rebbeinu Shalom can't cover himself. Memela, the coverings of the Rebbeinu Shalom, the levush of the Rebbeinu Shalom, is there for us to come to terms with the fact that in truth it's you, Rebbeinu Shalom. It's you. Your hiddenness is you. That is the grand total of the joke of history, the grand total of the joke of the Arizal, to come to realize that in the Shar Hanun, in the Klipa, and all of those elements that are symptomatic of Tzimtzum, in truth, I'm coming to encounter the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom. But Rabbi Nachman makes it very practical. Arbe, says Rabbi Nachman, is Rosh Tevos Achen Ruachu Be'enosh. Achen Ruachu Be'enosh. V'nishmat Shaddai Tavinem is a pasuk in Eov, where after all is said and done, and all of the attempts at cajoling Eov into feeling comfort in this world that seems to be devoid of justice or care or anything, so the Chevra try and comfort Eov, and the answer is Achen Ruachu Be'enosh. So too it turns out that there's a spirit of God that moves in man, V'nishmat Shaddai Tavinem, and their understanding is from God itself, meaning the radical secret that our own inner machinations and ruminations and experiences as a human being, all of those things which appear to be so devoid of the light of the Ribono Shel Olam are in truth the very expression of the Ribono Shel Olam in my life. As we're going to start saying in Elul, L'cha amar libi bakshu panayas penecha avakesh. As Rashi says and Rabbi Nachman points out, my own heart says, search me out. HaKadosh Baruch Hu whispers to me, whispers in my own heart, in my own concealment, search me out. The very definition and desire that comes from wanting to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the blessing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives me and offers me in order to find him. Meaning to say that all of the concealment, all of the ruminations, all of the struggle, all of the tzimtzum, all of the halal, all of the chilul, all of the empty space, all of the vacancy, and all of the real symptoms that come about through that, each and every single one of them are revelations of the Ribono Shel Olam, and that reorients the way that I grapple with them. It does not negate the difficulty, it does not negate the pain, it does not negate the need for process, but what it does is it allows me to look at the issue, look at the concealment, instead of looking at it with eyes of emptiness and potential distance or separation from godliness, God forbid. I now have the ability of finding a Kadosh Baruch Hu within the halal itself, within the tzimtzum itself, and that's what the Rebbe Shlita means, l'chayro, when it, or possibly when it comes to being mamtik the tzimtzum within the tzimtzum itself, to be mavato the tzimtzum from within itself, to show that the tzimtzum is also a revelation of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. And at that point, v'nishmat shadai tavinim, I come to understand that all of the machinations, all of the concealment of what it means to be a human being, are also simply the revelation of a Kadosh Baruch Hu b'chvadei uva'atzmo be'ezras Hashem.